Hi guys, it's Rory here. Just wanted to leave a quick note to say that if you enjoyed last week's episode and want to keep up to date with the content that we release every week, please remember to follow or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple, YouTube, or whichever platform you're listening to us on. If you're listening on Apple or Spotify specifically, please also remember to leave us a review. It means a lot to us and does wonders for pushing our podcast in front of new listeners every week. Once you've done that, leave a comment on Spotify or come and join us on X, BlueSky, or Instagram and let us know that you've left a review. It means a whole lot to us and we'll make sure that we get in touch with you to say thank you. Thank you once again for listening. Enjoy the show. Hello and welcome to the Football Heritage Podcast. I'm your host, Rory Bryce, and today I'm joined by David Moreton, who is a lecturer in sport, culture and history. David, thank you very much for coming on the podcast. It's an absolute pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thank you for inviting me, Rory, and it's, the pleasure is all mine.
No, not at all. It's great to have you on. We've got a really interesting discussion lined up for all of our listeners today. We're going to be talking about the mythology of football, or football and mythology, how those two things kind of intertwine with each other. And we're going to be doing it by looking at a very specific case study involving Burnley and Leyton Orient, otherwise known as the Orient game, which David has written and lectured on before. So we're going to be covering a few things that we've spoken about in this podcast this year, particularly on an earlier episode, which was our stories and our songs, which focus on football and storytelling. But this time we're going to be really jumping deep into mythology, what makes mythology, and how football and mythology connect with each other and interact with each other. It's something that as football supporters we do quite frequently, though we might not notice it. So I'm hoping that this discussion goes some way to helping people understand what football and mythology actually is. Before we start things properly, David, why don't you tell our listeners a little bit about yourself?
So, I teach at Burnley College. I teach A-level politics. I've got an academic background in sports history. That's where I did that's what I did my master's in sports history and culture at De Montfort, which is a fascinating course. I think it's even more important now that people are beginning to take football and sport more generally as a serious, historical and academic topic, really.
I completely agree with you there. I mean, where better than to have a sport, culture and history degree or be able to study that than in Lancashire, right? I mean, it's like the home of so much that we can attribute to our game, the kind of archaeology that's happened at Deepdale, at Preston, and just everything that can kind of be related back to football in Lancashire. I think it's probably one of the strongest places that you can academically study football. I completely agree with you that the study of football in more than just a sporting sense, so for example in a political, sociological, economic, whatever else, historic sense as well, is becoming much more popular and widespread and is actually getting taken a lot more seriously now, which is really good to see. And it's leading to really interesting discussions like this where we can talk about mythology in football and, not feel like we're maniacs, basically. So we'll start by going over a little bit of the context in terms of what we mean. Just within your own experience, David, what you teach and from what you've studied, what do we mean when we say football and mythology?
That's a really important question because lots of people would think that mythology is something that's made up. And whereas, it can relate to that, certainly when I look at football and mythology, I look at a history of a club like Burnley and how both the club and fans emphasise a certain aspect of the past whilst maybe downplaying others. And I think that's how mythology, in a sporting history sense, but in a wider historical sense, should be seen, really.
Yeah, it's a really interesting way to start this conversation. So within my line of work, I work within heritage, but it's largely built heritage that I work with, though we are opening our doors to allowing a lot more cultural heritage to be a part of the things that we fund, for instance. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is mythology, because what you can find is mythology, and if you go down to a lay level, folk tales can say a lot about a place, and the things that we tie in with our daily surroundings nowadays can be tied back to these folk tales or these mythical tales from, thousands of years ago. It's something that I find really fascinating. But like you said there, obviously there's a tendency to think that mythology is something that's completely made up, but it's not necessarily true. There is often a kernel of truth in most mythological stories. And I think by virtue of them being so widely spread and well known, they almost kind of become a half-truth in their own right. But importantly, what you mentioned there is that myths and mythology is as much about what you omit as what you tell in the story. And I think this is where it relates mostly to football?
Oh, I mean, undoubtedly, I've been thinking, although, as you mentioned, I've looked at the history of Burnley Football Club. I think, I've thought about football clubs like Liverpool and the whole history of the Shankly area, for example. I've looked at football clubs like Leeds and the whole Revie era. And I think there is a certain mythology that fits maybe not just football clubs, but any sporting club. Because, we are so attached as fans to football clubs that they become stories we tell about ourselves, I think, in many ways.
Absolutely. This would have been a few weeks ago now when we released an episode on Celtic Football Club. During that episode, our listeners who are tuning in for this one as well will remember that I tried to quote the the famous saying that was attributed to Celtic for when they founded. And I forgot it in that episode, but I've got it in front of me here right now. A football club will be formed for the maintenance of dinner tables for children and the unemployed. So it's a quote that every Celtic fan will be familiar with. We've all heard that. We all know what it means because it is the essence of our football club. And while Celtic was founded to do that, that quote, those words were never actually said or written down anywhere by any of Celtic's founders or within the vicinity of Celtic being founded. So it's something that's been created and then passed on as this founding myth of the football club. And I think what's really interesting about mythology is, like I said, this is ultimately why Celtic was founded. And it's almost taken this romanticised idea of the founding of Celtic and putting it in a way that people can accurately convey to others. So it's actually a really interesting way in how that particular myth has been used. And one of the examples that I quite like going to, because, it's a very, very common misconception. So even though people are saying this quote, and it's a myth, it didn't exist, it didn't happen, it still encapsulates what Celtic are all about, which in itself is a truth. It's really, really fascinating stuff.
Yes, certainly. And I think, when we look at the Orient game and Burnley Football Club, there's an element of that in that story as well, undoubtedly.
Absolutely. And again, it's as much about what is included in these myths as what's left out, I think, which is really important. And they're a really good way of obviously popularising the kind of history of our clubs and the heritage and all the reasons, all the different things why they were founded and why they came into being. We'll get on to Burnley and the Orient game soon because that's the one that you've worked the most on and actually lectured about previously. But are there any other examples that you've come across within your studies that might be good for our listeners to hear?
I've looked at examples which I think are really illustrative within other sports. Although I've written and teach in Burnley, I'm from Wales originally.
Okay.
And the myth around the Welsh rugby team and Welsh national identity, I think, is a fascinating one. Especially when you think that most, in Mid Wales and North Wales, it's association football that's the predominant game. But then if you were to ask anybody about a Welsh national sport, they would pick rugby.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I mean, I would immediately switch to rugby as well.
Yes, well, the beginnings, really, the origins of Welsh rugby being synonymous with Welsh nationhood, if you like, goes back to, I think it's the 1905 game between Wales and the New Zealand touring team, which Wales won, and was one of the first times, if not the first time, that the Welsh national anthem was sung at the game. And you can trace Welsh sporting identity and rugby back to that.
Right. Okay, I'm with you. Yeah, I mean, this is quite interesting itself as well, because then obviously we can tie mythology to how people feel represented, things that people feel are their identity. And ultimately, this is something that I feel is very important for football clubs because at the end of the day, many people support a team because they feel that that football team is the best vehicle to express who they are as a person. Not always, but most of the time. Obviously, a lot of the time that can be generational as well. It can be down to where you're from, your place, your connection from the club within the community and its presence there. But I'd say more often than not, it's about this kind of common idea of sharing an experience with like-minded people to yourself. And therefore the colours and the emblems and the symbolism of every football club is therefore an expression of your identity and who you think you are and who your fellow supporters are. And of course, mythology can be tied up in that as well. I think one of the most famous ones is, Athletic Bilbao, one of the most famous clubs and one of the best examples to discuss for anything to do with heritage in football. Don't know where they got their kits from. And the origin myths surrounding that as well. Did they come from Southampton? Did they come from Sunderland? Did they come from Stoke? Did they come from, wherever? They just don't know. And it's things like that. But interestingly, what we discussed in our stories and our songs, our earlier episode, was that although as football historians and football heritage professionals, we of course need to be really, really careful in terms of, laying out the actual facts and talking about truths. But there's a reason that no one is in any hurry to find out the origin of these myths or actually solve them, because it's the myths that give it the mystery surrounding the origins of the club. And I think that plays a massive part in why people choose to support a football team as well. The mystery is what keeps people entertained. It's what keeps them hooked in.
Yes, undoubtedly, yeah.
So in terms of your experience as a lecturer then, David, do you focus more generally on sport history and culture, or do you take a wider look at mythology as well in terms of explaining the sort of deeper heritage implications for mythology?
I've focused mainly on sports history and football history and mythology. There's some really good fan-led heritage projects within Burnley, so I've lectured there on occasion. And it's really, really interesting to see the fans, I think, almost taking ownership of the history, if that makes sense.
100%. So this is what I've mentioned it a couple of times on the show before. This is what I argued and wrote about in my master's thesis when I was doing heritage. The dissertation was on the heritage of football in Scotland, kind of looking at different case studies to explain different heritage concepts. And one of the things that I looked at was the dynamic in Scotland, particularly between how clubs lead their heritage and how fans lead their heritage. And it's interesting because at the top level, so Celtic and Rangers, the fans are the drivers of what I would say is the true heritage of the clubs. Obviously, there is the added element of sectarianism. So, Celtic and Rangers are quite keen to distance themselves from that. So they will just outright not discuss anything to do with sectarianism at all. And obviously that links to the Troubles in Northern Ireland and going quite deep back into Irish history. So at a club level, it almost feels kind of sanitized because they're ignoring that. Whereas the fans really, they lean into it, not in a way that's problematic. I want to emphasize that both fans from both clubs do an excellent job in driving the heritage of their clubs and their fellow supporters forward. But the further down you go, you actually notice that clubs like Motherwell, Hearts, who are really entrenched within their communities, they're actually doing a really good job at club level and working with the supporters as well, which you don't see every day, and actually helping push their heritage forward, which is really important. And again, mentioned it a few times, Kilwin and Rangers, who are in the West of Scotland Premier Division or First Division, the 6th or 7th tier of Scottish football, they've just recently opened their new museum. And because they're a former junior club, there's a lot more culture and heritage associated with that, completely different to that of the senior game in Scotland. But they've just recently opened a museum for their supporters. It's meant to be brilliant. I still need to go down and visit myself. But that's a club pretty far down, the pyramid within Scotland that's actually went out of their way to use resources to open a museum. So there's different ways of doing it. I completely agree. But I would always I think if you can get the club working with the fans to drive forward their heritage, it's a great thing. But that very rarely happens, and in which case I would always say that the fans are probably the best people to be able to do that. And of course, the fans are also the best people to write the mythology of the club, if you want to say that, for example.
And I think, looking at it as a historian, I think that fans or people who go to a football game, I think in quite a deep sense, engage more with the past than they would do by sometimes doing, a history qualification in some ways, in my opinion. In the sense that when you go to the football at Burnley, you walk down Harry Potts Way, which is named after Burnley's title-winning manager. You walk past the Bob Lord stand, which is named after Burnley's autocratic chairman from the 50s to the 80s. And I also think, wearing a retro shirt is engaging with either your past, if you're old enough to remember the shirt first time round, or if you're too young to remember the shirt first time round, you're wearing it almost to recognise that there is a history to the club that you recognise and understand.
Absolutely. I think there's a huge thing within the retro kits side of things as well at the moment. There's so many things we can go into. There's clubs in it. I would argue Celtic do it really badly, and Adidas do it really badly for Celtic. I can't remember which recording it was on, but I said before, like every heritage kit, in air quotes, that Celtic seem to release, it's always a fourth kit. And it's always something to do with like the Irish tricolour, and it's like, okay, but everyone knows that we were a club founded by Irish people and we're linked to Ireland. That to me isn't a heritage kit, because that's something that isn't. It's something that everyone knows about, even people out with Celtic. And for a heritage kit to work properly, you need to tie it into why football fans feel special about their football club. It's something that can only relate to them, because ultimately that's who the club is meant to represent. But then you've got clubs like Newport County, who obviously recently released their third kit, I think, which was... It kind of looks like the athletic club's kit, but it's to recognise the Basque refugee children who settled in Newport during the Spanish Civil War. Excellent example of a heritage kit. Almirante Brown, one of the clubs in Argentina, who actually had a mural of Admiral William Brown, the father of the Argentine Navy, on their kit, the man who they're named after. Again, excellent example of a heritage kit. That's how you properly recognise heritage. And of course, as we know, like, for example, Sunderland, who recently brought out their Black Cats kit. One of our contributors, Andrew Newton, wrote for our website an article about the story behind the Black Cats nickname and where that comes from. And the heritage of that story was really heavily reflected in the kit launch. Not so much in the kit itself, but the kit launch. So is the club still recognising this myth, recognising this origin story and this heritage, and using it in how they speak to fans? So you're absolutely right. It's an incredible way of connecting people to the club. And like you said, and in my opinion, it comes back to this wider idea that football is a great way to study wider societal trends and different subjects. But football is a great history lesson in itself. By looking at football, even your own football club, you can learn so much about wider society.
Oh, 100% agree. Yeah, as a sports historian, I think football's a wonderful window into kind of deeper societal trends and changes.
No, I completely agree with you. So let's talk about the Orient game then. This was a game that took place between Burnley and Leyton Orient. Obviously, you have lectured on this before and you've studied it pretty heavily. So I'll let you take the floor, David. Tell us about Burnley's Orient game.
Well, thanks. So, I started looking into it. It's actually my master's dissertation is on this. And it was a game in May 1987 that Burnley had to win to have any chance of staying in the Football League. It was the first year that automatic relegation had been introduced into the National Conference, as it was then, I think. And going into the last game, Burnley were bottom. They needed to beat Orient, who were pushing for the playoffs themselves. And they also needed results in other games to go their way. Now, Burnley won 2-1. Other results went their way. And Burnley stayed up, and I think it was Lincoln City who were relegated.
Okay.
And Burnley fans see this as almost the rebirth of the club, if you will. And that from that date, Burnley have generally progressed in the last 20-odd years, at least being in the Championship and a few seasons in the Premier League, as they are now currently. And I think one of the important elements to remember as well is when you look back at 1987, this is just over a decade since Burnley were in the top division and 20 years since they played in Europe and 27 years since they won what was then, the first division, the equivalent of the English Premier League now. So I would say, and certainly having researched it, that it's central to every Burnley fan's identity as a Burnley fan in one shape or form.
Okay, that's really fascinating. So obviously you've got this huge point of origin for the modern Burnley.
Yes.
And it's something that a lot of people attach themselves to. So tell us about the context behind the game then, because obviously, as you mentioned, there's some things that are omitted in the memory of this, and we'll get onto that in a moment. But tell us about the context of the game and the match itself. What were the repercussions of this match, and how did it help propel Burnley into the club they are today?
The sliding doors moment is quite stark in that if Burnley had lost, they would have been relegated. And for a lot of Burnley fans, there is a doubt whether Burnley would have survived. In the football climate at the time, you had just down the road from Burnley, there's a town called Cologne.
Yep.
And you had Cologne Dynamos that were being financed by a businessman to the extent that, Alan Kennedy, the European Cup winning fullback with Liverpool, played for Cologne towards the end of his career. And there was a real, I think, worry amongst Burnley fans that this could be the end of the club as they knew it. And the game itself, I think, and how it's kind of mediated or represented by fans and the club is seen almost as if it's almost like it's a Dunkirk moment, if you will. The town comes together as one to save the club. During that season, Burnley had gates of 1,600 to watch them getting beat at home 6-1 by Hereford. But for the final game, and estimates vary, there are either 15,000 there, 19,000 there or over 20,000 there, depending on who you listen to. And if you look at the footage of the game, the stadium is packed. And it is, whether it's been mythologized since or not, it's a really big story purely because, and it's shown that it's a big story, because the great and the good of Fleet Street sports writers are there to cover the game. They don't normally go and cover a bottom end Division 4, as it was then, football game. They were there to see the story, and the story would have been Burnley getting relegated out of the league, of course.
Okay, so that's why they were there. Obviously, a huge match within the context of Burnley's history and life. A lot of people obviously have their opinion on whether or not the club would have went defunct. And this is all part of the myth of it, I suppose. This is what builds a myth. It's what storytelling ultimately is. Adds drama, adds a bit of intensity to it. And obviously, we're able to say this looking back now. Thankfully, Burnley didn't get relegated. So, we're able to look back and thankfully say that hasn't been the case. But at the time, this would have been a huge, an emotional match for a lot of people, regardless of whether the place was packed or not.
Oh, it's an incredibly emotional match. The TV cameras are there, both ITV and BBC News are there. And, they focus on people in the stands in tears of celebration afterwards. You don't see it, obviously, at football anymore, but I'm old enough to remember when you used to take a little radio to the football.
Yeah.
And you see people listening to the results as they come in from elsewhere. And the interesting thing, when there's a section in my master's where I asked fans to send in their memories of the game, not one fan could remember, apart from the goals, which have been replayed time and time again, not one fan could remember anything about the game, but every fan talked about the emotion, the fear, the going there potentially for the last time and remembering that they'd been there with their father or their mother or brother or sister. And it brought home to me how football ultimately is about those kind of links that you have with past generations, whether they're about in your own family or, people that you went to the game with years ago.
It's fascinating how people don't remember the day, but they remember the intangible things. They remember how they felt. They remember the atmosphere in the ground. They remember what the repercussions were. They remember how everyone was feeling. And again, though, it's something that all football fans will have experienced at some point in their life, but don't necessarily know how to put into words, I think. A lot of people remember the tangibles. They know that the tangibles are there, but they don't necessarily know what they are or how to describe them. But ultimately, for me, it all comes back to heritage because, football is a part of cultural heritage. It's an incredible cultural expression. And the different feelings that we feel at football matches are things that you might not normally feel at any other point in your life for any other different thing. It's an incredible thing that comes back to, human expression and identity, as I said earlier on. But, like you said earlier, and one thing I'm really interested to know more about is that you mentioned that a lot of Burnley fans look back at this game as being an expression of their identity or something that they attach their identity as a Burnley fan to now. So tell us a little bit about that. I'm really interested to know why that's the case.
What I found really interesting when I was researching my master's and going onto the various club message boards, which I'm sure every club has, is you'd only have to go a few threads in before you found a thread about the Orient game. And it seemed to me that to a fan of a certain age who might have been at the Orient game, and we have to remember it was in 1987, which is getting on for 40 years ago now, that it wasn't just about Burnley winning. On the message boards when they were talking about the game, it was also about what football was like then, the standing on the terraces, the buying a pie, not that was wrapped up in cellophane and sold in the way that they are now, but from a woman who bought her own pies. Almost the celebration of toilet facilities and football facilities that were, looking at it objectively, that were terrible in comparison to today. So it's almost, I think, and there might be Burnley fans listening who will disagree, but there's almost an element of anti-modern football there, I think.
Absolutely. And the subject of this episode is one that we will talk about in future. It's a pretty big subject, so I really want to make sure that we get it right to talk about it on this podcast, but it's going to come back to football and nostalgia. Now, obviously, like ourselves, there's a lot of different accounts on social media that talk about football nostalgia. They claim to be football nostalgia. Obviously, we're called Football Heritage, but, whereas we kind of talk about things a little bit deeper on our podcast in terms of things that we post, there's not been a huge amount that's went deeply into a discussion between football and nostalgia. Now, nostalgia is an incredibly important thing for a number of reasons. It's something that is inherently political, something that is inherently historical, and more often than not, nostalgic things are craved by people during periods of disconnect and when they don't feel particularly connected to their place, their identity, who they are, etc., etc. So they look back the way. We look back the way because we have comforts. We were younger. We weren't as attuned to the world around us and all the shit happening on a day-to-day basis. So we look backwards to the comforts that have historically helped us through life and made us feel different or made us feel safe or given us a distraction. And football is one of those things. The amount of people talking about football in the 80s and 90s, and it's because they grew up through that period of football, so they remember it very fondly. That sounds like it's part of that as well. You've got this whole idea of people looking back and talking about this game as being part of a wider football nostalgia that is being yearned for by people. Do you see where I'm coming from?
Definitely. And, you'll see fans talk about the team, the 11 who played that day, as being Burnley heroes, which in one sense they are. But they are also, without doubt, the worst team in the club's history. And if you look at the game, and I've watched footage of the game the whole 90 minutes, by anybody's viewing, it's a poor game that you would expect, from a team fighting survival in Division 4. And there's no reason why it should do. That doesn't matter necessarily.
Yeah, I'm with you. It's interesting, again, drawing comparisons. I can't remember the year. I think it was early 2000s, maybe mid 2000s, when Dundee completed their Great Escape season after being handed a pretty hefty point deduction. But they managed to avoid the drop despite having one of the worst teams in their existence. But it's talked about as being one of the greatest seasons, not the greatest in terms of performances or, for the reasons you might think, like having great players, but it's a great season because they avoided the drop. So it's quite interesting how that can play into people's mindsets and kind of evoke this mythology around it as well, actually.
There's also an element, on the Burnley message boards of, I think division might be too strong a term, but going back to when I did my dissertation, so 2020, and Burnley was still in the Premier League then, but not necessarily wonderfully successful Premier League team. And if any younger fans started complaining about the modern team, you could guarantee that somebody would always talk about how they really knew what it was like to have a poor team because they were there for Orient. And so there was almost a safeguarding of the club's identity, I think, from the fans who had been there, or maybe even perhaps think they had been there.
I'm with you. It's similar to Celtic's debate in terms of fans who were there during Celtic during the 1990s, which is one of the worst periods of the club's history. Obviously, the club nearly went out of business and nearly ceased to exist as well. But in terms of watching the football, obviously Celtic, there's a huge waiting list for season tickets, and there's always been this kind of debate that, if you're a true fan of Celtic, if you spend all of your money going to Celtic, if you have a season ticket and go to the away games, it's just nonsense. It's just not true. You can be a true fan in any stretch of the word without having to pay a single penny. It doesn't come down to how many tickets you buy or whatever. But there's that aspect to it. But then there's all these guys that will say, well, you never saw Celtic during the 90s. You're being entitled. We can't win trophies all the time. And they are almost gatekeeping how it means to be a Celtic fan themselves and their own identities, because they see themselves as being more of a fan because they went to see Celtic during about a decade or more where they were absolutely torrid to watch and the football was absolutely turgid. So they see themselves as the true fans because they suffered through that and pushed themselves through it. So they gatekeep it and they kind of get, not aggressive, I wouldn't necessarily say it's divisive, but they certainly get their backs up when people come in and say, Celtic should be doing better, because they see this as being not a purple patch, but I think they're obviously worried and they understand a bit more that Celtic could end up becoming really shit again. and therefore they kind of have that perception. So it's really interesting how these myths kind of sway our opinion of our clubs and lead to these divisions within the fan bases.
The other interesting thing that, in my view, happens with the Orient game, and I can't remember the exact saying, but it's something along the lines of, we choose our heroes to reflect how we would like to be. And one of the heroes of the Burnley story in the Orient game is the manager, Brian Miller, who was local born and bred, had played for Burnley in the First Division Championship winning team in 1960. I think he got one cap for England. The story goes that he always signed his autographs, Brian Miller, Burnley and England, rather than England and Burnley. And he became manager, and I think he epitomised how people in Burnley and fans in Burnley saw themselves, maybe even still today. But certainly in 1987, with the decline of traditional industry in this part of Lancashire, and well, in the industrial areas of Britain as a whole, really, that he was honest, he was hardworking, he was local, and he was straightforward, in the positive sense of the word.
Yes.
Whereas, lots of Burnley fans looking back at the Orient game will look back to when John Bond was manager of Burnley 3 or 4 years previously. And John Bond, who managed Man City and Norwich, was a typical of a 1970s and 80s flamboyant football manager in a camel hair coat and driving a nice car, etc. And it's interesting how Bond, even though he was manager 3 or 4 years previously, is still seen as the villain of the piece by some people. Whereas Brian Miller epitomises, I think, everything that Burnley people see as, human qualities.
It's a really interesting subject, and I'm glad we've finally tackled it in this show, because we're getting into some really, really good stuff here. So I don't know if this was covered in your dissertation when you were speaking to people. What was the feeling like in the aftermath of the Orient game? Because this is going to be quite important as well. Often, and again, it kind of comes back to nostalgia, often we don't realise something as a myth or something has been mythologized until, decades after, as has been the case with this, because, for the most part, in the short term after that match, there would be a celebration, feelings of happiness, feelings of relief and joy and euphoria and whatever. But football quickly moves on, and supporters have to quickly move on as well. So at the time, it would have probably been quite short lasting, I would imagine. And then only years later, when the Orient game started being discussed as this turning point or origin point for modern Burnley, would there have been a realisation that it was actually being turned into a myth?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, there's the immediate aftermath of celebrations where, as the old saying goes, when any sort of town team wins a big game in any sport, that, the pubs were drunk dry. And, one of the goal scorers in the game, which I'm sure if you're a Scottish football fan, you'll remember Ian Britton, who played for Chelsea and Dundee United. He was seeing out, I think, his league career at Burnley, and he scored what turned out to be the winning goal. And the story is, whether it's true or not, who knows, but the story is that he never had to buy a drink again in Burnley, and he lived locally. But, the facts are that even after survival, Burnley weren't promoted from the 4th Division for another 5 years. So this story of it being the immediate rebirth isn't factually, if you look at it, correct in many ways. And I think, people looking back, people begin to maybe attribute value and worth to the game that simply wasn't there the season after or the season after that. But I don't think that's necessarily unique to this game or to Burnley fans at all.
Yeah, I would probably agree with you there. I think it's something that we all do. It's something that all fan bases do. And again, with the passage of time, there's a good quote that's like, it's the best bits that are coloured in.
Yeah.
And it's talking about memory. Do you know what I mean? So when you're thinking back on these things that were really emotional and really poignant events in your life for your football club, then, you're going to remember the parts that you remember like enjoying. And obviously you will, also remember the parts that you felt really strongly about something, even if those emotions are negative. But ultimately, as time progresses, you're going to remember the good things. You're going to remember the things that made you feel happiness and joy instead of the things that made you feel stressed and, afraid. Yeah. Even though those things might still come up, ultimately you're going to forget some of the bad things and some of the intricate and important details that surrounded it. And at that point, is when it starts becoming myth and people start mythologizing it because they agree with you. And it's no one's fault. It's not done maliciously. It's not done intentionally. This is ultimately how myths are created. It's an incredibly traditional thing. It's something that's been done for thousands of years, but people, I think, don't acknowledge or realise that it's as prevalent within football as it is in storybooks.
Oh, undoubtedly. And one of the things that I hope I was able to do, looking at the game, was to look at deeper kind of historical issues, if you like. And there's a book, not that I'm comparing a football game to the Blitz, but there's a book by Angus Calder called The Myth of the Blitz, where he writes about how people who lived through the Blitz, their perception of what the Blitz was like changes over time because of how the Blitz was portrayed throughout those years, if that makes sense. So people who were interviewed in 1960 would remember the Blitz vastly differently to when they were interviewed in 1940. And I think that undoubtedly happens, with Burnley fans who maybe were at the game looking back 38 years later.
Interesting. So there's almost a kind of similar process that happens as if a traumatic event was happening then.
Yeah, I think so. And, the popular kind of perception of the Orient game being, the turning point for Burnley gets so reinforced over the years. And this time when the town comes together to save its club, that's how people remember it. Even at the time, they are sort of talking about how, the town is divided and how the club's going to go out of business and how they hate people who have turned up for this game having not been there all season, etc., etc.
Yeah, no, it is really interesting. And I think, we kind of said in our stories and our songs that the really simple and easy to spot examples of football mythology is when, like, I don't know, you're speaking to a family member who's a bit older or the old boy that stands next to you at football matches and they're like, oh, I remember X player, he used to be able to dribble the ball for 50 yards and no one could touch him. Like, players would bounce off him. Or, oh, this player was really terrible. Like, it looked like he had two left feet. It's really simple stuff. It's things that have worked its way into our daily vernacular and language, but those are very simple examples of what a myth is and where mythology comes from. Obviously, we know it's not true, but these are just kind of some of the ways that it starts creeping into football, and then it develops into the larger stories about players, how they train. One of the famous ones about Jimmy Johnson is that he used to train in his dad's mining boots so that it could get better. That did turn out to be true, but for a very long time it was a myth. So therefore it's passed from myth into fact, which again is brilliant in itself and is really fascinating. And what other kinds of myths can you think of that can be attributed to football? Because it's not just matches, it's not just clubs or players, but there's so much about our game, especially in the early years, that we don't know. So there are some historical myths, but there are others that are a little bit more romantic in nature and a little, I don't know, it's interesting trying to find the words to describe it, but they're a little bit more on the nose than maybe some of the ones we are exposed to on our own clubs might be. Just wondering if you've come across any others that you could compare to the Orient game.
Certainly, if you go back into the 19th century, this idea of, before professionalism, that you had teams like the Old Etonians who would play for the love of the game, and that was kind of reward enough, I think has definitely been mythologized. This kind of amateur ethos, I think, is kind of highly questionable from a kind of historical standpoint.
Yeah, I think I would agree with you. There's a lot of research that still has to be undone to almost kind of myth bust in certain ways, and I know that kind of defeats the purpose of what we're talking about. But there are some things that you read and it's like, well, these have clearly been under researched points which have almost become fact, whereas what we're talking about are things like memory.
Yeah.
And mythology, how things that have happened end up becoming a story. And storytelling's important for that as well, as we spoke about in our stories and our songs. So there is quite a good crossover between the three of them. And as I said earlier on, I don't think there's, and I'm certainly one of these people, I don't think that many people would want every single myth in football to be, busted.
Oh no.
Or to be corrected, because at the end of the day, it's that element of mystery that gives a lot of our football clubs their origins and what they are today, and it is something that can connect people to them as well, of course.
Oh, undoubtedly. And in terms of the Orient game, another thing that kind of I found fascinating was how the club itself used the myth to an extent. So that during the pandemic, when there was no football going on, the football club every Saturday would play a game from the past. It was called Back to the Fixture.
Nice.
And the Orient game would be one of those games. But the interesting thing for me as a cultural historian would be the footage was obviously from the time, 1987, but it was overlaid with a modern commentary, which almost kind of signposted significance moments in the game, which there is no way that you would know from 1987, but you would from 2020 if you know the story, if you like, behind the game.
I'm with you. So this was almost like a kind of a modern physical application of mythology in the works.
Yeah, well, I doubt the football club would say that, but I certainly, in my view, yes, that if you listen to the commentary, the commentator would almost signpost, and it's a free kick for Burnley. You know, when Ian Britton scored, it's a free kick for Burnley, and Britton's gone into the penalty area. Well, Ian Britton was probably the shortest player on the pitch. So you wouldn't necessarily flag up that he has made his way to the far post if you were doing the live commentary. But there is a kind of signposting of this is an important element, this is important, this is important. So almost like leading fans through the myth, if you like.
Interesting. That's brilliant. I mean, there probably will be out there, and there was a lot of different things, shall we say, that football clubs tried during the pandemic.
Yes.
I've never heard of that example before. I think it's brilliant, and it's a really good way to see how the myth of a fixture makes its way into modern day language and dialogue around the game. That's really fascinating. So, in terms of, I suppose, further studying football and mythology, where would you say the best places to go are? What types of things should we do and look out for when we're engaging with the myths of our football club, if you want to say that?
From a personal point of view, I think I'd start off by saying, although some historians are really, really good at what they do, I don't think myth busting itself is that important. Because in many ways, I don't think it necessarily matters whether something is true or not, or if something is overemphasized or not. Because I think sometimes you can learn more about a fan base or a society by the myths or the stories we tell about ourselves. So the way I would look at it, or the way I look at it is, I'm not concerned about whether something is actually 100% historically accurate or not. That it's looking at the stories that football clubs, or societies for that matter, tell them about themselves and what that says about the fan base in terms of a football club at a given time.
So you would just say keep an open mind then in that case, but engage with the fact and acknowledge the fact that you are looking into something, studying something, and kind of engaging with a form of entertainment, but something that ultimately is connecting you with your football club.
Undoubtedly. The interesting thing for me is, although I've looked at it as a historian when I did my masters at De Montfort in Leicester, that I am also a season ticket holder at Turf Moor. And when I go to games, I don't go to games as a historian looking at all the montages on the walls and all the history that surrounds you when you go to games. I don't go to games as a historian going, well, that didn't happen, or I wonder if that's true. So I think if you engage with football history or sports history, I think it's also important, to remember that the thing that brought you to sport or football in the first place was an interest and a passion for the game, I think.
An interest and passion in a game, or a myth, or some story that you heard as a child that kind of lets your imagination run wild a little bit. Again, they're things that we might write off and have been written off in the past, but the things that are incredibly important to forming the opinions that we have about our football clubs and the connections that we have with them. So I'm glad that we got to have this discussion and talk a little bit about mythology and how it plays a role in our game and how it plays a role in connecting us with our football clubs. I think the Orient game and how you've studied the Orient game and presented the findings of that are one of the best ways to doing it.
Oh, thank you. It's really kind of you.
That's all right. Is there anything else you'd like to mention just before we finish up, David? Where can our listeners find more of your work if they're interested in reading a little bit more about this?
Well, I'm always happy to share. Maybe if I'm just about to start my PhD at Reading, not looking into football, but looking into sheepdog trialing. But if I pass on my academic email address to you, then if anybody is interested in further discussing it, then they can certainly email me. And if anybody is interested in studying sport from a kind of academic historical point of view, then the International Centre for Sports History and Culture at De Montfort University in Leicester is, I think, the place to start, I think.
Fantastic. Well, we'll include notes and links to all of those resources in the show notes to this episode so our listeners can go and find out more. Of course, thank you very much to all of our listeners who tuned in for this episode. If there's anything that you would like to ask, if you have any questions, and please do email us. That's hello@footballheritage.co.uk. You can also DM us on X, that's @_footyheritage. You can also do that if you have a topic that you want to suggest yourself for this podcast. This is how this episode happened. David reached out to us on email. We spoke for a little bit, and now we've been able to have this amazing conversation about an incredibly interesting and fascinating subject. So we do get back to people. We do respond. If you have a topic you think you want to cover, then please do get in touch. We'd be more than happy to talk it through with you. I think that'll do us for this week. David, say goodbye.
It's been a pleasure. It was amazing to find the work you do in the podcast and the website. So it's been a pleasure, and thank you.
Thank you very much. It's very kind of you to say, and likewise, it's been a pleasure speaking with you today. It's goodbye from me as well. We'll see you all again next week. Goodbye.